what's going on, music producers? One of the coolest things about Ableton Live is that you can create an amazing sound from scratch in about a couple minutes. And you can do this from a sound or a texture that really might not seem to have a musical value when you hear it. Just sounds like a texture, like a sound effect. But you can create it in a very simple way. I like to call these resonant textures. It's a texture that resonates with a discernible tone that you create, and then you can use that as the basis for a keyboard patch. One of these very famous older synthesizers called Omnisphere is kind of considered a landmark for this kind of sound. It's used a lot in cinematic textured soundscapes. They even have a very famous section in that synth called playable textures, and it kind of goes along with this idea. It's a really cool style of sound, and you can create an Ableton Live using just stock plugins that you already own and using some extra stuff that's for free on Ableton that you might not have tried yet or downloaded yet, and we're going to get into all of that. So you want to start with a vinyl sound effect, and you can see right here I have exactly that. It's basically just the sound of vinyl, and I'm just triggering this in Simpler, so it's just vinyl crackle. You know, nothing too crazy about that. But basically what I do is I use the ADSR. I turn the sustain down. Usually by default it's up. I turn that down. You could also add some release to this if you want as well. But basically I'm creating a bit of a decay. So it's kind of acting more like it has an envelope on it. Something akin to what you'd expect from when you hit a piano key. Okay, so if we look towards the right, we have this thing called the C note resonator. I have it labeled. It's basically just an Ableton group of effects that's going to create a note around that texture. And I'll link this down below if you want to just download it. Basically, it's just using EQ8, and you can see I have this big resonant peak, specifically around 261.63 hertz, because that's actually the value that creates a C note at octave 4. So by doing this, I'm basically creating this resonant peak. And you can see here, if I pull this down and I spill this out towards the right, you can see several of these EQ8s. Because if you do this just once, you won't really hear it until you start stacking them. At a certain point, you stack them enough. I also compress it and add some audio effects to create a stereo effect with some chorus and some delay to add some decay. It's going to give you a nice tone, which you can hear right there. Now I'm just hitting the C4 key on my Midi keyboard, so I'm triggering the Simpler to play that vinyl sample, but now that EQ8 is adding on a tone because I've created those resonant peaks. If I was to play a higher C, like a C5 on my Midi keyboard, it would change a lot. It wouldn't exactly respond the same way, but I'm going to hit C4, and that nice kind of lower mid-range tone is coming through. But as I hold down the key, I can still hear the vinyl crackle. So the texture now has a discernible tone. And this is what we're going to sample from. So basically I play that into an audio track, which you can see right here. And this is very simple to do. If I just move my camera, you can see that you just tag your audio track to the track that has Simpler on it, and then you just hit record and you play it in, and then you'll have your audio one shot. Now the reason why you do that is because then you have something that you can drag and drop into a new version of Simpler, and you can just trigger it as a one shot. So if I go ahead and grab another version of Simpler, bring that in, and we just drag and drop this one shot in. Remember, this is just something that I played in just like I was doing before, but now I have it in a new instance of Simpler. Maybe I'll move these tags here because I didn't bother to trim it. And now you have something that is basically a one shot that you can trigger. And it's kind of interesting. It has sort of a sound to it. I could turn up the release. You could put a bunch of reverb and delay and different effects onto this thing. You can also experiment with turning the warp on, which will add kind of interesting, strange artifacts that are kind of cool sounding when you play higher in pitch, further and further away from the original one shot's pitch. And it'll have a really cool synthetic sort of texture added to it. So that's sort of the basic thing that you can do, but you can take this much further using granular synthesis as well, which utilizes a very nice free instrument that a lot of people might not have downloaded yet with their Ableton DAW. Okay, so here is Granulator 3, and this is a really cool plugin that a lot of people might not know they actually have access to as an Ableton user because it is for free, and I think the requirement is just Ableton 12, I believe. And basically it's the same idea, simpler. You drag and drop the sample into here. And the thing about granular synthesis I found, and this is especially true for myself, is that I always wondered what kind of samples actually work well with creating musical sounds from granular synthesis, because granular synthesis can kind of sound very experimental, but it's a highly textured way to make sounds. When I drag and drop that one shot into here and I use these settings that you can see at the bottom, it creates a very ghostly kind of re-triggering effect of that sample. And the interesting thing is that, like I did before, I'm moving up in pitch away from the original pitch of the sample, and the artifact sound kind of changes as you re-trigger that sample using a granular synthesis. And you can see all those little lines on the screen, and those are all the individual grains sampling from the sample. So it gives it a very interesting sound. You might lose some attack from doing this, but depending on the position that you choose and the settings you want to play with, I'm just using these settings here and I'm combining it with that same kind of envelope before. Longer decay, no sustain, maybe some release, and then I'm also using this cool filter effect here, sort of like a notch filter. It creates a little more of a phase to the sound. And you get a very nice soft textured vinyl pad sound, which is really cool, right? It sounds very ghostly and warm. And then these other effects also come from another maybe lesser known extension that you can download totally for free from Ableton. I think these spectral effects came out around the time of Ableton 10, I think. So they've been around for a very long time, and spectral blur is sort of like a reverb-esque kind of decay adder, and it sounds really, really cool. Spectral time is also a similar effect with different parameters on it. And this adds even more sort of dimension and decay to the sound and sort of softens it a little bit too. And you'll find that when you do this with different types of organic sounds, think of wind, rain patter, heavy rain, light wind, ocean waves, all these different kinds of textures. I'm going to create some of them down here below. You're just going to get a lot of really interesting kind of sounds that you can use as a polyphonic keyboard patch. So this is kind of interesting too. Here I have some wind gusts and I'm just triggering it. As I hold down the sample, you can hear some of that wind coming through. I can also take EQ8 and just go in and carve it out. So maybe I'll add on this little high shelf. Bring through some of that wind as well. And then we'll just run this through Granulator as a one-shot sample and see how it affects it. Sometimes you also play around with the attack when you're originally creating the one shot so that, for instance, here we have rain. It doesn't necessarily add as much of a strong attack to the sound, so you can kind of shape it the way you want. And then I also sometimes will use these big shelf kind of moves to carve out, you know, rebalance the mid-range, because all these EQs here are just creating the resonant tone. So then you have an EQ you might add on after to just kind of create a balance where you add some of those high frequency textures like the rain sound in this case, and kind of rebalance it the way you want before you go into resampling it. And you can see I can rebalance it with an EQ after Granulator. Here we have birds chirping. Here's some nice radio static. And you can use the EQ and saturation before the spectral effects, so you can kind of control the tone of it, maybe saturate it and kind of make it kind of glued together even more so before you hit it with those spectral effects. Really cool patch. Again, you can download all of this for free down below if you just want to get started and drag and drop it in and be creative. So here's another fun idea. Here I have this 90s VHS plugin. This came out through the Reactor user library. It's actually totally for free. It's been out for a long time. But this is like one of my favorite kind of VHS tape kind of texture plugins. If I turn it on, you can obviously hear there's a lot of mechanical sounds going on there and noise and whatnot. This whole section is just all like textures. Basically, it's like a big texture mixer. And I'll just like kind of run the sample through this thing as well, just to add on that VHS tape kind of effect. And then we'll run it through Granular, see what it does to it as a resampled pad. All right, everyone, that's going to wrap it up for me here. And by the way, I probably already mentioned this in the video, but you can just go ahead and download this for free. All these things that I created in the video, if you want to play with them, have some fun. You know, it can be a little bit tedious to create this chain yourself with all these EQs and maybe some effects to add on some better sounds to it. So the C note resonator, I'm just going to link that down below. You can do this with A at 440 hertz. A lot of people do it because that's a nice round number. I tend to go with C note because of the fact that when I play on my keyboard, I'm triggering a C sample. So everything's key consistent how I'm triggering it on the Midi keyboard. But you can do this with an A note. You could do this with other notes as well, right? Other frequencies. There's this nice frequency chart you can find here. If you just type in notes to frequency on Google, you can also experiment with this concept with other frequencies. So it's a pretty neat idea. You're just adding resonance to create a musical effect and then resampling it with other devices, right? So you can download everything down below totally for free. There's a lot of other cool stuff there, especially on the Patreon. If you haven't checked it out yet, it's a really fun place to be. So I'll leave it there. Have fun making music.